I say voluntary hasn't worked, let's make it compulsory. Let's set down some fair decisions and criteria for which firms have to do it and how it's done, so that we just don't end up with a set of statistics or league tables that none of us understand. And let's try and change this. 19.2%. In the Times, they estimated that it's going to take another 47 years for it to be equal. Well, I won't be here. And that's not good enough, I want it now. I'm not working, of course. So I want it now.
Any responses to that? Okay, Judge Kent, do you think publication could cause harm to the individual worker?
Well, I think I broadly agree that publication is a good idea, but I do think it depends on which type of industry you're in. So for what it's worth, Anuja and I are both judges, and in fact our salaries are published. They are part of the judicial salary scales, and they have been published for years on end. But they are the sort of salaries where it's probably relatively easy to do that. The first thing is they haven't changed it in years. They change them very rarely, and if they do, trust me, it's only by minimal percentages. But they don't have to justify different salaries for different people doing similar type jobs, because there are bandings of work. So it's relatively easy to publish and probably relatively easy to get right. I think where you're likely to have difficulty is where people are paid because of the particular subtlety of the work they do. Perhaps they're also paid bonuses, and that might change from year to year, and indeed with things like bonuses from quarter to quarter. It'd be interesting to see how organisations would keep that up. But also where people are doing work which might be dependent on the income that they're generating, or the sector that they work in is generating, where the bonuses might be sensitive to that. Of course, you run the risk that there'll be a lot of cross-comparison and perhaps worse than that, targeting of people by reference to numbers. And what we all know is the devil's always in the details. So I can see how at its extreme end, it can cause quite a lot of work, expensive work, and potentially how people could find it very upsetting to have their income bandied about. But that doesn't mean that as a general principle it isn't a good idea to at least be looking at it.
Any responses? Any comments?
About the naming and shaming of employers, we have to be very clear about what we're naming and shaming them for, because the gender pay gap figures. We're not talking about pay for men and women doing the same work or in the same job grades, and the gender pay gap figure is very much affected by the proportion of men and women in different occupations. So, for Deloitte, for example, their raw gender pay gap was something like 17.8%. But when they looked at men and women in the same job grades, then it shrank to something like 1.5%. So, one of the problems with the gender pay gap reporting regulations, and I think this is, very much exercising employers, is that it's a complex statistic, and it's bandied about as if it's relating to the fact that men and women are doing the same types of work, and they're not. And that's one of the issues with part-time women. That actually, the gap is largest between part-time women and full-time women, and indeed, really, in terms of the female labour force, we're getting increasing polarisation within women, within the female labour force, because full-time women and their earnings are expanding, they're progressing really quite well, but part-time women are stuck predominantly in low-paid jobs that are often designated as low-skilled. And indeed that was one of the major concerns of people who gave evidence to the House of Commons Select Committee on the gender pay gap. That really, we've become obsessed, partly because of government policy and the way the government's framed this, obsessed with women on boards and senior women when there are vast armies of very low paid women out there. And we really don't quite know why women gravitate towards low paid occupations which tend to be designated as low skilled, but they dominate the adult social care sector, they dominate commercial cleaning and so on, and their issues and dilemmas I think we really haven't focused on.
I think you're absolutely right to focus on things other than getting women to the top. And my big thing about this, and it's slightly hypocritical because I'm very active in our women's network within DLA Piper, and we very much do want to push more women into partnership. We want to see more women in our executive levels, and both within our company, within our clients, and dare I say it, within our competitors as well. But my personal belief is that that's not going to solve everything, because what we actually need is more equality overall. So let's not only talk about having a short list of women for executive positions in terms of making your recruiters gather further people in, but let's talk about having a short list for a secretarial position that must have at least 50% men on it. Let's think about making sure that one job isn't seen as one gender, the other job isn't seen as another, in everybody's eyes. But the problem is that this needs real societal change. Is society ready for that? Because we thought we had the answer in the 80s when a lot of the top graduates from the top universities, more than 50%, were women. And we thought, this is it, the skills gap is gone. People have the same ability to do the jobs. But 35 years on, here we are, still talking about similar things, and we haven't quite pushed it far enough yet. And I think that's because we're focusing too much on women, and we're not focusing on broader and wider equality in every walk of life.
But I think, just to say that it's not overwhelmingly negative. I mean, it's actually quite a positive story for full-time women, and the gender pay gap statistics bear that out, and particularly, for women who are less than 40. But it's much less positive for part-time women who tend to be segregated in very different, in very different occupations than full-time women.
One of the issues, of course, is not just the issue of children, but actually just caring responsibilities generally. So a lot of people care, particularly in this generation, not just for children, but also for parents. And that can have a huge impact on whether or not you can dedicate yourself to full-time work. One of the interesting things, and we've touched on it, of course, is that women sometimes are compelled to achieve some sort of work-life balance. You may not achieve it, but at least you try. And sometimes I think men miss out in not being compelled to do that. Because what you do, if you are looking after your children and perhaps your parents, and having to occasionally do the school run and the school cake sale and all those sort of things, and go to the supermarket, is you become very embedded within your community. You build social ties. And women, generally speaking, are quite good at that. So within our family, my husband's quite sociable, but I'm the person who makes the dinner party appointments with other friends. And so we hold that together. Women, therefore, sometimes have a lot more social ties and support. And there is a risk with some men, and you do see it, particularly in professions like the law, where they have achieved a great deal and they get to the end of their career and they're facing retirement and they're scared. And they're scared because actually they haven't got, it's falling off a cliff. They haven't got a world to go into because they've been so removed from that world for so long. And I do think men need to think about that as well. It is so important that you have a life, and that work is so that you can have a life and you don't just work because that's the only thing you do in your only interest. Because one day work comes to an end, and all those people who think you're wonderful at work, when you walk out that door to be retired, well, they might have you back for coffee and the odd drinks, but their life moves on, and you then have to have a life to go on to. Whereas for many of us, we are embedded in the life that we've had to manage. And I know the people in my local supermarket almost by name because I have to go in 2 or 3 times a week to make sure the children and the cat's fed, etc. And I am the loo roll fairy. I am the person who knows when we're running out of loo roll. My husband, if he's very, very busy, can go to work and come home for a whole week, and he won't notice that anything's growing in the fridge, but I will. And it is, I do think it is about balance. A lot of the caring responsibilities that we take on, perhaps we've always taken on historically, but actually they're not all a chore. You know, they do actually tie you into life.
Does that mean we're compelled to being overrepresented in part-time, low-paid, what are regarded as lower-skilled jobs? And I say no. Why can't there be equal pay for women? I don't care how you slice it and dice it. If you look at women who are on the boards, top of companies, it's less than half. If you look at female judges, how many are there of us? There's me showing off about going into a dining room where there were 2 women out of 12. I thought that was quite good. Well, where are the courts where there are 50% women? In your court, how many?
There are 4, but we're very nice.
4 out of how many though?
4 out of about 11.
Well, that's
And
not
we think
bad.
that's good.
No, that is good. That is good. At the Old Bailey, there are 18 courts. There are 2 full-time female judges. The High Court, at every level, overrepresentation of men to women. And why is that? And it's great that the under 40s are doing well. And if I was under 40, I would think that that was good enough. But I don't, because I'm not.
Well, I'm not saying it's enough, but I'm saying that we should, and indeed, you know, I think that, I mean, I think we've got to acknowledge, though, that women's investments in education are actually now paying off. And,
Yes.
and that actually,
Yes.
when we take a historical perspective, is a huge advance.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think, you know, there may be some bad news stories, but I think there are some good news stories, and we need to, you know, to kind of
I think the
acknowledge
interesting thing about education, though, is that actually educated women can be very pressurised to stay at home to look after their children. There's a huge amount, if you decide to have a child, it's a huge amount of information thrown at you about, you know, if you're not eating the right thing with kale and spinach on a daily basis, sort of creamed up with chia seeds, and you don't breastfeed for the rest of your life, and you don't feed your child mushed up something or the other, that everything's going to go desperately wrong, and if you don't take them to baby swimming classes, etc. And because educated women sometimes have the economic background to make choices, a lot of them can feel under a great pressure to stay at home, and the cost of childcare is so much. If you want good childcare, you've got to be earning quite a lot of money to justify good childcare. When I say good, I mean all round sort of singing and dancing childcare. I suppose good is a value judgment. Whereas women from lesser economic backgrounds are sometimes forced to work because they just have to, and that little bit that they do earn is very important to the household income. So, you know, you can be, education is a great thing, but I've certainly seen amongst my peers a huge amount of pressure on women about the way they bring up their children.
And I think you're absolutely right, and I know, you know, I mean, people have kind of, researchers have observed that, you know, there's all this kind of intensive parenting that, you know, you've got to be with your child every minute of the day, and you've got to, I remember when I had my child, I haven't had so many children as some of my female colleagues on the panel.
2 men.
I've had one child, and I found that pretty challenging. But I remember, you know, when I had my son, and you know, being presented in hospital just after he was born with all these leaflets that, you know, if you didn't breastfeed, you know, the child would have seriously low IQs and so on. you know, there is a lot of pressure. You know, one has to kind of navigate that, you know, that's why I think it is important to actually stick in there and to, you know, to go back to work and to kind of take maternity leave, because I think when you know, if you do take very big gaps, big career breaks, then it's in those situations where it's really difficult to really make it up in terms of what you've lost.
There's the other side, which is terribly negative to say, which is that actually, unfortunately, if your relationships don't work, and you find yourself on your own bringing up children, having a reasonable career so that you can support yourself, and not finding that all of a sudden, you know, your whatever lifestyle you have has come to an end, and you're suddenly, having not worked for 15 years, having to work out who you are, what your identity is. All of those issues can arise if you choose not to work, and that's an awful, miserable story that, you know, when you're talking to 21-year-olds, it's not a nice story to say. It's not nice to say to them, well, just think, your marriage might not work. And it may be that, you know, your children will leave home and you'll have empty nest syndrome. That's not nice. But actually it is one of the realities, you know, sometimes if you haven't had that career, you might find later on in life that you wish you'd made different choices.
I think it's time for audience questions.
Yeah.
If we could get some in. Does anyone have any questions for our panel? Go on.
Hi, thank you so much, all of you. That gave me a lot of information I already knew, but a lot of perspectives I had never thought of, so I really appreciate it. I have two questions, one for Professor Walsh and one for Judge Kent. Professor Walsh, I'm interested to understand, like, obviously, the taking maternity leave has an impact for women, like they're not able to accumulate as many kind of years as experience in their career and thus affected. But for women that are affected by many things even before they get to the point that they have a child. So for example, if we talk about domestic violence, 1 in 4 women are going to be affected by that, 1 in 10 men are going to be affected by that. The emotional effects of dealing with something like that, and the consequent professional effects, and stuff like that. Like how in other ways can women be supported to not get to that point where such a long time is taken out of their career, even before they get to the point of having children. And Judge Ken, I was really interested in the quota idea. You said that you don't support positive discrimination on quotas, but I was wondering, is it not so much the qualifications, because I definitely agree with you that I think men and women are equally merited, but it's actually the application process that is much more traditional and conservative, and then thus leads itself more to promoting itself to men. So for example, if you're advertising a board executive position, it's going to be advertised in the Financial Times, which is more likely to be read by men, therefore you have more men apply, therefore men seem more qualified, etc., etc. So curious about those two questions.
So Professor Walsh first.
So what, you're interested in how to kind of reduce the length of career break, or have I misunderstood?
Yeah, no, exactly that. That really, like, women seem to face many reasons that their careers will be interrupted, other than just simply having children. And what kind of ways can that be assisted? That's not.
Well, I mean, the most sophisticated work where, you know, an economist, you know, and particularly in the United States, get these fantastic data sets where they can control for a whole load of confounding factors. So, you know, they can control for men and women's education. They, you know, they control for hours of work. You know, you factor all that out, and then you try and discern, you know, what is going on here, what actually explains what's happening to, and you know, what people are interested tend to be is this gender pay gap. And you know, it reflects, or at least, you know, this fascinating work on MBA, men and women, it reflects, you know, the if you like, the leaves that women are taking, the time out from the labour market, even though, you know, on average it's not that long, it's, you know, kind of 12 months. And, you know, in terms of the kinds of statistical work that they do, what they find is it is very much linked to having children, and particularly the first birth. That's what they've found. So, I mean, I haven't got data on incidences of, domestic violence or whatever. I mean, I haven't seen kind of research that factors that in. But they do tend to factor in a lot of the kinds of individual, personal characteristics, educational characteristics, human capital. I mean, economists would call it human capital, characteristics and differences between men and women that could affect your finding. So all that is taken into account. And that's what they found, that it is something to do with what happens in and around the first birth and the way in which, in this case, MBA women respond to that compared with men.
Just dealing with the idea of quotas, the equal merit provision assumes that you can make a comparison between people, so you can make a judgment as to whether or not someone is more qualified for a role or not. And more qualified, of course, includes both your academic qualifications and your personality qualifications, depending on the role. But I think before you actually get there, there are all sorts of other issues to think about, including the fact that in order to be in certain jobs, and I'm thinking more high-level jobs, it helps to be a confident and outgoing personality, because you need to be promoting yourself. And a lot of applications are about self-promotion. And one of the difficulties we have in society is we bring up our little girls generally to be modest. We bring up them to be, delicacy is a sort of nice female quality. Anuja and I, of course, are managed without. But, it can be a bit contrary to the sort of, the underlying psyche, which is we do like our, we see female qualities as being those sort of more delicate qualities and the bombastic qualities as being more male. And when you go in for these jobs, all you need to do is self-promote. You need to say, I'm excellent, I'm brilliant, I can do this job, I'm the best person for the job. And it takes a bit to do that. So, for example, within the JAC, the Judicial Appointments Commission, one of the things they're trying to do is to help people fill in these dreadful forms. Because as we make it as a more, a system which can be looked at and compared to make sure they're making the right choices, so as we make that audit trail possible, we also then make it a more convoluted process. And people have to tackle the dreadful forms and the interviews and tick the criteria and the competencies, etc. And there is help out there for them, but it isn't straightforward. It is a spectrum thing, that you take one end of the spectrum, which is who is the individual and what is the individual type of job they're applying for, and then the generality of what is the impact on women generally within society. And it's just a big spectrum, and it's hard to do one size fits all.
But I mean, what you're saying and what Georgina's saying is absolutely right. I mean, and it goes to something that actually, I mean, people refer to the psychological glass ceiling. What they mean by that is, the kinds of leadership stereotypes that we have and how gendered they are. And we only have to look at the treatment of Hillary Clinton. And I mean, I teach this stuff to my human resource management students, and who are overwhelmingly female, by the way. And we talk a lot about leadership, and this predates anything to do with emails or whatever she's supposed to have done. I mean, Hillary Clinton has been consistently vilified for a long period of time, and it's all this because she appears to be a tough, decisive woman. And goes to the heart of those kinds of stereotypes we have, think manager, think male, that kind of thing. And I think that's changing, but it's still there.
And it's interesting how you might look at a woman in that position and look at what she's wearing and how she's dressed, but you might not look at a man in the same position quite as critically. And I find myself doing it sometimes, without thinking. I see someone who's prominent and think, oh, could have done the hair better. Maybe that's
Shame on you.
Yeah, maybe I catch myself. Oh no, nobody is without prejudice. You just need to know what your prejudices are and work with them and ideally work to counter them. But we're all prejudiced. We all think things, and sometimes we don't even realise what we're thinking. But it's very fundamental. It's not just a question of these wonderful statistics, etc., and principles. It goes to the very psyche of how men and women behave, are brought up, from the moment the little girl gets the cooking set and the boy gets the whatever you're not allowed to give them guns now.
Are you not?
No, you're not allowed to give them guns anymore.
George and I are best friends. We have very different approaches to things. We met at bar school, and that was in 1989. 88.
I was much younger than her.
And George was much nicer than me, I was going to say. So George's approach to most things is to be reasonable and balanced. And my approach is to say, let's have change and let's bring it about now. But one of the things I am passionate about is domestic violence. Far too many women suffer, and far too many women suffer in silence, and far too many communities allow it to happen. And my approach to domestic violence is, you'll be surprised to hear it, zero tolerance. More women should report it, and more men should be prosecuted for it. And there are degrees of violence. I know there are statistics of women being violent to men as well. But the level of violence and the level of domination and manipulation can sometimes be quite different.
Are there any more audience questions? Right at the back over there.
Yeah, hi, sorry, I've got, first one is for Mrs. Walsh. The quote upon the gender pay gap, whereabouts are you sourcing that from? The one for the woman under the age of 40 is almost equal?
Well, that's the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, so it's the government's own set of statistics, and they're the ones that, that are widely reported.
Sure thing. And then about the salaries being published, at the moment, Times Higher Education produced a report where they're saying that the gender pay gap at King's is 17.7%, and King's have produced a report that says it's 20%. There's a bit of discrepancy there. Do you reckon the salaries should be published?
Well, they are for individuals earning a particular amount, actually. I can't remember what the cut-off is in terms of what that is. I think I don't know if that's £150,000. I'm not sure. So there is some kind of public publication of information, but I mean, universities are looking at the issue of the gender pay gap. They certainly are. I mean, Essex University has recently boosted their pay of female professors quite substantially. At King's, and I think that it's a matter of kind of public record, I think the analysis tends to suggest that it's not, again, about differences in pay between academics in the same job grade. It's the fact that there are more men, if you like, occupying highly paid positions than women, and that's also to do with professional services staff. So it's not just to kind of to do with academic staff. Now, why? That's the interesting question, and that is a difficult one to answer. I mean, one issue is that I'm a female professor, but there are not that many female professors at King's. I'm also deputy head of staffing in my school, so I have a lot of responsibility, human resource responsibility actually, for about 80 academic staff. And the issues are complex. I mean, some of the research suggests that men, particularly in the run-up to research assessment exercises, get more outside job offers from men from other universities. They appear to be more mobile than female academics, and again, that you have to ask the question why. It may be to do with the fact that women are more risk averse than male academics. I mean, they're not putting themselves out on the labour market. Perhaps they don't negotiate tough enough in terms of pay increases. But there is something about the external labour market too, and that's something that we need to look into much more about. The role of headhunters, the way they kind of pry staff away from, and it's not just universities but other organisations too. So there are a number of causes. probably underpinning that, but it's not, it's challenging. But it tends not to be, a big pay gap when you're looking at people along the same pay grade, but it's just that you've got more highly paid men at the top. And that's what it's about.
Any more questions? To the left.
Yeah, I was just reflecting a little bit on the discussion on organisational culture and working hours. I was just thinking, what if there was some kind of policy where there were limited working hours? Say like everyone had to work 9 till 6, but you get these kind of organisations, I guess particularly in your profession, you're saying the legal profession, where people will work like 75-hour weeks. If there was something to stop that, do you think that could be, something that could reduce the gender pay gap and improve the number of women top of these professions?
I think within law firms that's not going to happen as it stands, because we still bill out at hourly rates, which means the more hours you bill out, the more you're bringing into the firm. And obviously it's a business, we need to make money, so that ties directly into the value. Now there are actually a lot more other complex factors around that, which we can factor in to get a percentage contribution that each person's actually making, which doesn't only factor in those hours, but that still really heavily weighs on it. What's people have really been talking about in the last, say, 5 years or so within the legal sector is working more on fixed fee basis. And as we start to see fixed fee basis coming in, I think that more value is going to be put on people who are efficient, who get things done within a shorter amount of time, who don't stay there all night. And I think that that may well bring a shift in culture to people working more standardised hours, because there's not going to be so much value put around doing other things. It doesn't mean that actually you can put a cap on it, because at the end of the day we're there to service our clients' needs, and even if you have done a fixed fee, you're still going to do the best possible job you can do for your client, and that might mean working more hours than you've budgeted for. But I think as we see the fee structures changing, that will help to change some of that working culture.
I'm going to take 2 more questions, so to the right here.
Hi, I was wondering whether this is for any of you, whether you think that this issue of sort of the gender pay gap should be brought into education, because I left school literally a couple of months ago, and not once do I remember any teacher or academic tutor sort of encouraging me when I leave and go into the workforce to fight for equal pay to men. You're sort of told in a really discreet way that it's not important, and that like you sort of think about that when you get to it, and that's just one of the things you have to accept. And I'd like to believe that I had a reasonably good education. I wonder what your views are on that.
Where did you go to school?
I went to Christ Hospital in West Sussex.
It's very interesting you sorry. I was listening to High Court Judge speak a couple of nights ago, and she said that when she was at school, and it was a state Catholic school, and her husband had been to a Catholic school as well, they were taught to be obedient and to aim low. To do well, really, really well, but to kind of maybe not be the doctors and the lawyers. So she wanted to be an interpreter, and realised that she wasn't very suited to that, so ended up as a lawyer and now a High Court judge. She asked her husband, who went to a similar type of school, but for boys, whether he had been taught to be obedient and not to ask for too much and not to aim too high. And the answer was completely different. And it's frightening that that is still going on at schools, and it shouldn't be.
And I think that we are sometimes taught that, if you're good at what you do, eventually people will notice and you'll get what you deserve. And I'm afraid that's not necessarily the case within the workplace. Sometimes you notice that the people who shout the loudest actually seem to do better, and that's all terribly unfair and against the sort of principles that you start off with. but it's definitely, certainly been my experience, that the people who shout loudest sometimes get unjustified benefits. But there, I mean, going back to schools, there's an awful lot to teach people in schools. I mean, it's a lovely concept, this idea that, you know, women can do anything they want. And the answer is yes, you can do anything you want. But actually, it's not without having to make choices, and it's not without impact of choices. And as a young girl, I believed, and I think a lot of young girls go into the professions thinking they're as good as the chaps, they can do as well as the chaps. And then you hit the realities of life like children, and you find that actually it's not quite so straightforward. And it might take you years to actually work that through yourself and understand that it's not just you. So there's a lot that we can equip young people with.
Okay, last question. Lady right at the back there.
Okay, I'll try now. My question was actually about children, sort of the other side of it. I was wondering what you all thought about the opposite side of women who choose not to have children, stigma that surrounds saying that a lot of people say that you don't fulfill your life if you don't have children, you choose to dedicate it to the work life. Do you think that there is a sort of lasting stigma for women who choose to not have children? Focus on that more rather than choose to have children?
Well, I think children have an impact on your work life, but actually, even women who don't have children sometimes find that their paths aren't necessarily as straightforward, because men and women are different. And one of those things is, like I said, women aren't necessarily as pushy as some men might be. But also, they're the other side of it, which is that women are sold the story that you can have everything. And there are plenty of women who go into the workplace, and by the time they decide they might want children, they find that actually children are hard to come by. So you spend all of your youth trying not to get pregnant, and then you find people who actually have to make it almost a job. They've got diaries. If you go to Boots, they have these ovulation calendars, you know, and then it becomes a chore. So that's the first thing, people who might want to have them and then can't. But actually, I mean, children, you know, they're a choice. Well, for some people they're a choice, and it's perfectly legitimate.